Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to our talk. Before we get started, I want to give a big shout out and a thank you to the sponsors and the organisers for putting on such an amazing event. It's been brilliant. We're going to start the talk with a video. Fingers There's no question that Agile is being adopted more and more in different parts of the world. There's real momentum behind the movement. Yet, we've seen there that there's lots of different behaviours and values in different parts of the world. So, what we're here to talk about today is what impact does culture have on Agile adoption? A couple of years ago, we started seeing articles appearing such as, "You can't do Scrum in China," or "Reasons why Agile doesn't work in Germany." So we began to investigate this. We started thinking, is there such a thing as an Agile culture that arises whenever teams and organizations start adopting Agile? Or do underlying cultural behaviors always prevail? Are some cultures more naturally suited to adopting Agile than others? If we think about all of the different Agile practices that we're seeing, not just Scrum, Kanban, XP, all the big frameworks, there's lots of new practices coming out all the time. User stories, TDD, BDD, new movements, new ideas coming out all the time. So with this big combination of all these practices, coupled with all the different values and behaviors in different parts of the world, can we really truly get back to the Agile mindset for all organizations and all teams practicing or adopting Agile? Quick introductions. My name is David Spinks. This is my partner, Glaudia Califano. We are Scrum practitioners. We've been involved in Agile teams for a number of years. Between us, we've got around 20 years experience from everything from working within teams to being Scrum masters, Agile coaches. Nowadays, we do more coaching, whatever that means, and we also do a lot of training nowadays. At the beginning of last year, we began a journey. We decided to travel the world, looking at how Agile had been adopted in different parts of the globe. We Spent 3 months traveling through South America, through the countries such as Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and then 3 months in Asia, through the likes of Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, and the Philippines. Coupled with that, we looked at our own experience working throughout Europe and in the UK. So we want to share our journey with you. We're going to talk about why we think this is important, what happens when cultures collide. We think this is a really important subject as globalization becomes more of a thing, as there's more mobility and teams are working more distributed than ever. So we're going to have a look at what happens when cultures collide. We're also going to share some models for categorizing culture. Now, a big part of successful organizations is how well people are communicating with each other, especially in agile teams. So we'll look at some communication patterns. And as I mentioned, give you some ideas and thoughts around working with diverse teams before we sum up and give you some takeaways. So let's get started with what happens when culture collides.
Oh, I didn't know Springfield had a Russian district.
Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to the museum?
С удовольствием! Это 6 кварталов в этом направлении! Она пошла не в ту сторону.
Шах и мат.
Хорошая игра! Как насчет еще одной?
What do you mean by that?
Two teams very evenly balanced today?
You think so?
Well, I'm asking you.
You think so, really? You think that's a question?
I'm asking you because you were smiling with him at the end. Was it an acknowledgement that you'd balanced each other
Because
out?
he's my friend. No, I was not speaking about the game. Do you think the game was like
No,
that?
I was asking because you were smiling with him.
I can smile if I lose, if I win, if I draw. There's nothing to do. You are asking a question about the game. Do you think the game was like you were saying?
No, that's not what I said. I didn't say what I think. I'm asking you what you think. I'm sorry. That's just what I'm asking.
I'm sorry to say, but it's a silly question.
Okay.
When a team crossed the midfield line once in 90 minutes, and the other team is for 90 minutes with the ball in the opponent half, trying, you are telling me that one team cancelled the other one and each other. We didn't have to defend. We didn't defend. We had the ball all the time, and David De Gea was sleeping, and because he was sleeping, he made that funny thing. I was laughing with that funny thing because it's the only way to react to that.
So a couple of examples there where we've got a few cultural clashes there. Jose Mourinho getting very angry, animated, showing his emotions very outwardly, and going into quite a long rant and monologue at the end there, while the English interviewer was getting very flustered. So a lot of the misunderstandings that we have is when we've got cultural clashes. But let's step back a little bit. What do we actually mean by culture? So let's think about how we define that. So culture is made up of many different factors, many different layers. It's not just our nationality, but the different region that we're from, our professional background, our economic background, our political beliefs, our religious beliefs, generational differences, gender plays a part. There's all these different factors that define what a culture is. So when you think about all of these different things, it becomes quite a complex situation. So this is why using some cultural models can be a useful tool. So we're going to have a little diversion and just have a look at a couple of those. So there's been a lot of work in this area by various psychologists. One of the most famous, Gert Hofstede. So he created 6 dimensions of behavior, and he gave different nationalities scores based on how strongly they exhibited different behaviors. There's other work by the likes of Fons Trampenaars and Alan Hampton Turner. But we were drawn to the work by Richard D. Lewis. Now, Richard D. Lewis's most famous book is this one, When Cultures Collide. It sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. It's based on his work from traveling to 130 different countries, and he spent significant time working in 20 of those. He gathered a whole heap of data, over 150,000 surveys and questionnaires. what Lewis wanted to do was create a tool for managers to start managing cultural differences. When we looked back earlier, we saw all of those different factors that defined culture. And if you think about it, we could end up with like hundreds or thousands of different classifications, ways of making groups. So this is what Lewis was attempting to simplify. He basically found that human behavior could be put into 3 distinct categories, which we've got here. And he named them linear active, multi-active, and reactive. We're going to go through these during the talk in a bit more detail, but just to give you some idea, the linear active behaviors are those where people like to follow step-by-step plans, do one thing at a time, as opposed to multi-active behaviors where people in this group are very comfortable multitasking. Linear active people, the linear active group of behaviors, confront with logic. If we could contrast that with multi-active, emotions come into the arguments quite a lot. If we look at the reactive group, these are the great listeners. They like to absorb things, take their time, and understand things before making decisions. For reactive people, face is very important. They don't want to cause embarrassment to themselves or other people. So as I say, we're going to go through some more examples of this during the talk, but this is just to give you a flavour of those 3 main groups. So Lewis created a visualization. So this is the Lewis model, which he gave his name to. And as you can see, he's created 3 corners, 3 points of this triangle, one for each of the 3 groups. And he's mapped different nations depending on how strongly they exhibit behaviors from the different groups. Now, it's important to say that countries could be at similar points on the triangle for very different reasons. So this is a relative model. There's always going to be behaviors that people exhibit from all of the 3 groups. It's just a question of which ones dominate and how strongly the behaviors are exhibited. So as you can see, Greece is up here, very, very highly multi-active, along with other parts of the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, as well as Latino countries in South America, so the likes of Colombia, Chile, Argentina. I'm from the UK, down in the bottom left here, so very highly linear active. And I must admit, I do exhibit a lot of linear active behaviors. So as well as the UK, we've got other parts of Northern Europe, Germany, Luxembourg, as well as USA. And on the right-hand side, you can see the reactive countries, so the likes of Japan, China, Vietnam. So this becomes a useful tool to start understanding cultural behaviors that we're seeing. So for example, I could do a test as an individual and see where I fit on this triangle. If you think about if I'm hiring a sales manager for my China office, and I've got a great candidate in front of me, but they score really highly as a multi-active, I might think about putting him in my Colombia office instead of my China office, for example. So with that context set, Glaudia is now going to talk through some of the more detailed of some of the behaviors in these groups and also how that relates to the Agile teams that we were seeing during our travels.
Cool. Thank you very much, David. Right, let me get my hands right. So I'm going to go a bit more into these 3 areas, but also how that relates to the Agile teams that we have seen on our journeys. So I start with the first group, which is the linear active group. And in linear active thinking, we really think we can control life with facts and logic and rational decision making. We also like to create plans and adhere to this. These plans are made on timings, we adhere to it. On our linear thinking, we also think that human aspirations and feelings are important, but they shouldn't influence our decision making. So it shouldn't stand in the way of the facts, actually, where they go. So prosperity and success in a linear active world is seen because of orderly planning, of things, of rational thinking. So how does that relate to the teams that we have seen in linear active countries, such as the UK? Right, so the difference that we've seen in linear active behaviors or linear active teams is that professional and social is not as much intertwined. Your colleagues, yeah, you can go for drinks with them, you can have nice team lunch, but they're not your family. You don't tell everything, you don't tell your emotions. It's less intertwined. So when it comes to, for example, we're doing retrospectives, we see also in linear active environments that people are quite happy to say their opinion, you know, because they're based on facts. It's not an emotional attack on other people. They're not that close to their colleagues, to their team members, so they feel like they can share that opinion. Sorry, the next one, the clicker. So we were, the linear active world is also a bit more transactional. And with transactional, I mean is that we look for sales, so for quick profit, instead of actually building relationships. We do understand in the linear active world that relationships are important, but we still want to make that transaction and make that short-term profit. So detailed planning and metrics, so we do see quite some detailed planning still going on in the linear active world. When I come back a bit later, a few slides later when I talk about that, so I'll just skip that for the moment. We, especially in the UK, I think there was even research done that the UK is quite an individualistic country. So when we come to Agile teams, we need to spend some more time on collaboration, make sure that people actually collaborate. So encourage pair programming. That's sometimes seen as, oh, then I just pay 2 people to do for one person's work. So things like that. I was at a mock programming workshop in Merit this morning, which was great. So all those things as well for people to collaborate and encourage that behavior. So when you work with linear active teams or people that are very linear active, that's something as an Agile coach, for example, that you have to encourage even more than with other teams. So we focus on deadlines, which is good. So in our linear active world, we do have a good focus on deadlines. We just have to make sure it's not in spite of quality. So we don't rush just to hit the deadline and say, okay, we're going to fix that thing later, or we're just taking shortcuts in there. So we need to keep an eye on that. And we expect rules to be followed. So an example, like I said, in the UK, or linear active worlds are still very much built on the Tayloristic model, which worked, of course, great in the production line, where you have repetitive work, where you have a predictable outcome. But now, currently, and I think Alistair Cockburn this morning already talked about it, about the VUCA world we're in now, that Tayloristic model doesn't really work as well anymore. So in many linear active countries, we need to unlearn things, because we do have that legacy of that Tayloristic model. So it's unlearning that control and command kind of approach, which also brings me to the more project thinking mode that we're in. In the UK, I just use the UK as an example because that's where I live. We have a high contractor market. People still are very much in a project thinking mode. They hire a bunch of people, a bunch of contractors, deliver something, and it gets dismantled. So it was really funny when this morning, when I wrote his name down, Tanassis, if I'm not sure if I said that right, from the Beat Pitch, mentioned that he went to Amsterdam and that they said, oh, we have a whole team where we can place into your company. And that brings me to the next slide, because the markets, the linear active market, have recognized this. That, you know, we have this project thinking mode, but teams actually don't have time to really go through the Tugman stages, to really gel together. So there's quite a few consultancies who try this new approach, which they call pop-up teams. So these are teams that have been working together already with each other. So they know each other, are gelled. There's still a bunch of contractors, but they just get placed as a team at a client. So the client get already teams that are really established, that have best practices, etc. And the contractors actually feel they are part of a community as well, which in the contractor market sometimes you just feel you just go from right to left and just switch jobs. This is in contrast, for example, we went to Japan, where people like mostly maybe work at 3 companies in their whole life, and that's a lot. So people actually stay, are very loyal to their company. While in linear active countries, we do switch jobs more. Which brings me to the multi-active anchors. And the multi-actives also think they can control life, but a bit less on facts. It's more about feelings, emotions, persuasion, etc. Relationships are really important, and here we have actually where your colleagues are your friends, your colleagues are your family. We were in South America of a company which they offered as a perk people could work from home. They still prefer to come into the office because they really want to interact with their friends. So it's very important having those relationships on there. There is more hierarchy, and so, but the human interaction and human contacts actually goes horizontal and vertical, so across the hierarchy and up and down. So you still have this people-centricness that multi-actives really expose behaviors. So with regards to teams that we've seen, so socially and professional intertwined. So the example that I already gave about the company in South America that just wanted to come to the office. So when we first discovered this, we thought this must be great for retrospectives, or you want continuous improvement, and people will just speak to each other because they all know each other, they're friends. And actually the opposite was true when it came to that, because it was really hard for them to be open and direct because they didn't want to hurt their family or their friends. So yes, you can do retrospectives, but you just have to do that maybe in a different way than the linear active person would do. One example, we had an Agile coach from Germany who went to Colombia, ran his first retrospective, and people were really in shock, and some people were even in tears because it was just probably a bit too direct. So he needed to adapt that kind of style to run that in a different way that people don't feel emotionally attacked. So maybe based more on facts, doing flow-based retrospectives, etc. There's loads of techniques for it, but it's just something to take in consideration. Very relationship-driven, I'll come back to that. So I'll skip that one. And that one as well, the lightweight planning in there. So what we've seen at the teams, the multi-active teams that we've seen a lot of big picture. We've also seen a lot of story mapping, thinking with the client, really having that big picture, that big overview, and many, many ideas. Sometimes that could lose focus because there's so many ideas, and people like to communicate with each other and having that relationship. So focus is something that, when you have teams that are very multi-active, is something that you can just spend some more time on as well. Questioning, so people do want to do the right things, they do question things. Maybe it also becomes of the communication, as I said, that goes horizontal and vertical, that people feel confident actually to ask and question things, and more experimental as well with regards to that. So the examples that we've seen. Right, it wouldn't be our presentation if we didn't have a Dilbert, because we always have a Dilbert. So, yeah, I'll let that sink in. So this is a company in Chile, and they are a software development company, and they work with clients mainly national or within South America. This is actually their contract that they have with their clients. It's only 12 pages. It's literally very high level when I talked about this high level and less detailed planning. And it's mainly focused on the ways of working, how they work and collaborate with their clients. Because here, customer collaboration is more important than contract negotiation for them. So it talks about having the product owner, the client is the product owner, having the client a certain percentage in their office, working together with their teams. It's also really important for the teams to have a good relationship with those clients, a direct relationship. So this kind of gives you the idea how they work. Now, we did speak also with companies that then had, for example, the same approach working with clients in the United States, which is a very linear active, where a lot of linear active behaviors are. And that's where it clashes, because of course, you know, they'll want contracts and things to be really in detail, and you know, when is it going to be delivered and exactly what. The other thing with regards to this company as well is that the scope was so variable, because what they would do, this was the high-level plan, they would constantly test and learn and then pivot. So every week or 2 weeks, they would put something out there, test it, validate, and go like, well, maybe this wasn't right, or, oh, this is really good, and etc. So it was really kind of that way of working together with the client. So you need really good customer collaboration for that. Then we come to the last, this is like the reactive, and the reactive actually group in our reactive world, we don't think we can actually control life. It's just the sun goes up and down, the stock market rises and falls. We can't really control, it is what it is. A lot of it, the reactives actually have quite a lot in common with the multi-actives with regards to relationships. Relationship building is really important. So if you do business with people in that area, it's really important to first build those relationships as well. Collective harmony, I think the last point, the face, that's actually not wanting to lose face, and I think we come back to that as well, because that is probably what has the most impact on Agile adoption for reactive people, because failure is really very scary. I think in certain languages, I think it was in Japanese, it's actually the word failure is really, really strong. So I'm just looking at David. Yeah, so with regards to that, it's that experimenting, of course, is scary. And for example, putting an MVP out, without, having everything put out is difficult, breaking things down in smaller pieces on your backlog. So those kind of challenges you will get with reactive people, or people with very highly reactive behaviors. So socially and professionally intertwined here again. So as I said, quite some commonalities with the multi-active people with regards to that. So relationship-driven, very people-centric, highly collaborative. It was actually in Japan where we saw mob stations and people mob programming all together as well. It's a very highly collaborative environment, which is, again, when it comes to Agile teams, of course, something that you really, really want. So there's where the really good point is. As I mentioned, must not lose face. So it's important as well when you work with people that have very much reactive behaviors, is the way you ask questions, not like, is it going to be delivered on the 10th? They probably will say yes, because they don't want to lose face. So just question it in a different way, so you can have more like a discussion about it. So without them having to lose face. And again, it is very hierarchical in most of the reactive countries. Status, again, is important. However, there is very much a consensus-driven environment as well. So, which brings me here to Nimawashi. So this is from Japan, and here's actually where companies seek, consensus, seek approval from employees. It actually literally means going around the roots. So it's an informal way of building consensus, of changing of a new process or new project. So they will go around the company to get that buy-in from every employee. Now, this can be, and we had quite some discussions about this, is this actually a good thing? Because you get buy-in from everyone, so that's awesome. But actually, can it also slow you down? So when we talk, for example, the product owner role, or decentralized decision-making, this can actually be a hurdle. So it has some good points, but it can also be a hurdle in there. That actually it slows things down for agility, because you don't have that really quick decision-making on there. So one of the teams in Japan that we visited was a completely Japanese team, but their Scrum Master was from the Philippines. The Philippines, when you saw the Lewis model, is a bit more between multi-active and reactive. Of course, there used to be, I think, Spanish colonies and from the United States as well. So it's a very mixed kind of behaviors that they have. So their Scrum Master was from the Philippines. She started full of enthusiasm with a completely Japanese team. And her first retrospective, this was a Scrum team, was a mad, sad and glad. And it was a complete car crash. Because in Japan, you have a concept such as Hone Tatame. And Hone Tatame means, Hone means inside, you know, your inside feelings. You save those for your family and friends. And the tatame is actually what is socially acceptable to come out, you know, in your workplace. It's like the social lubricant, really. So for them to talk about emotions at work is just not really something that you would do. So a retrospective with kind of emotive language, which they feel is emotional, was not a really good idea because they just completely stopped. They just couldn't think beyond that. So the next time she just used start, stop, continue, which is kind of the same concept, but it didn't take that emotional language in consideration. So hence that worked much better for a team like that. And that brings me back for David, who talks a bit about communication patterns, because it is all about language and communication now as well.
So as we saw there, the use of language has a really big impact on how the team was working together. So let's now just focus in a little bit on how communication affects how people work together. Let's look at a quick example. We'll look at a Finnish communication pattern. We should have some sound.
Over the coming years. Let's
you.
see what former world champion Mika Häkkinen has to say about this.
Do you think that Formula One does need to look at cutting its costs?
Yes.
So we can look at Mika Häkkinen there and think him eccentric and even maybe make a bit of fun out of him. But that's not really fair. What we saw was just typical way that Finnish people communicate. So in his work, Richard D. Lewis did a lot of analysis and a lot of work on the different communication patterns, and he created different visualizations, different models. And this is the Finnish one that we can see here. As we see, very minimal word base. And when there's a period of miscomprehension, the Finns actually use even less language. They try to be as succinct and as clear as possible to get to clarity. So these are negotiation patterns that we're looking at here. If we contrast this with another culture, another nationality, say the Spanish, as we see a much more complex communication pattern, we've got a much wider word base. The language begins with, it's very emotional, romantic even. As people build relationships and as they get through their negotiations, discussions, if they hit miscomprehension, they actually increase the language used. They increase the eloquence. As I say, as the relationships begin to build, again, that language becomes even richer, the word base becomes wider and wider, and they use richer language to get to that period of clarity. Let's look at one more, my own, the English. So if anybody has worked with a British company or is from the UK, you might be familiar with this scenario. So we don't like to rock the boat. We want to keep everything calm and collected. So we begin our meetings with maybe 5 to 10 minutes of small talk, being polite to each other, and we'll introduce our business almost as if it's an imposition. We'll try to make our proposals sound as reasonable as possible. If we hit resistance, again, we keep calm. We use coded speech, understatement, try to keep everything sort of in order. We may use humor, stalling tactics. We love our tea breaks, so we might take a recess, come back together, and summarize all of the points that have been discussed already, and then agree that we're going to make a decision at the next meeting. So that's typical British meeting pattern that we see there. I'm going to delve into the British coded speech that we saw there. So we say things like, that's an interesting idea, when really, if I'm talking to another British person, I know that they're really saying, that's a stupid suggestion, that's a bad idea. Or we say things like, I'm going to get back to you on that, or we're certainly going to consider it, which really means, nah, we're not going to think about that. But if we think about if you're not part of that British mentality or that cultural thinking, this could create so much confusion. If we contrast that to maybe a culture such as the Dutch, who are very direct, very literal, say exactly what they mean. So if I say, I'm going to get back to you on that to a Dutch person, they think, brilliant, great. They're taking my idea seriously. So the language that we use, the way that we communicate, can have such a big impact on understanding, and of course this is going to have a big impact on how our Agile teams are working with each other. Another example is in Japan. So the Japanese, their communication is through body language, through what is not said. They call it reading the air. And if you're not part of that culture, again, you're going to miss a lot of that communication which is actually going on. So again, this becomes more and more important as we get to more globalized teams, more distributed teams, more multicultural teams. So Glaudia is now going to talk about how we can start creating value with diverse teams.
Yeah, so as we said, people do have a multitude of multiple behaviors, like not someone is completely has all the multi-active behaviors. It's always a bit of a mix. I'm highly multi-active, which drives David absolutely mad because I always have brilliant ideas, but yeah, he likes to do things one by one, so hence why. But it's actually really good to have a diversity in your team. And as we saw earlier at the beginning, when David said culture is not only nationality, it's also gender, profession. So having a diverse team with all these kind of different cultures in there is really important because it actually can bring you a much wider perspective. Now, this is an example of Lewis again, where he just talks about you have, for example, a linear active behaviors, a team with very strongly linear active behaviors. You do get a view, but it's much narrower than if you would go to a team that actually already has linear active and multi-active behaviors. And ideally, of course, in Agile teams where we want to go to is actually also having that innovation and trying things and having ideas and bringing products to the market, etc. So if we look on the right, that's actually where we combine all those behaviors and we actually create diversity in there. So can you think of teams where you have a mix of multi-active behaviors, linear active and reactive behaviors, where you go like, you have great ideas, you have people actually who keep the focus, like the linear active more parts of it, and then the reactive kind of behaviors to collaborate. That is just like the power of having a really good team. So you would think this is an absolute no-brainer. However, there is some work to be done because there has been some research done that in some cases diverse teams actually perform less than homogeneous teams. And that is because they go in clash with each other, because they don't understand each other's cultural differences. They don't have empathy for each other, where their people are coming from. And then you actually have less performance. There are managed well, cultures being managed well, so I'm not saying a manager managing it well, but cultures, the cultural differences managed really well, can actually, however, outperform homogeneous teams, and that's where we want to go to. So there has been some research done. These people, I always forget their names, Di Stefano and Mazanovsky, they actually have written a paper on this. They talk about map, bridge, and integrate. So with teams, you can do exercises, you can do workshops, where you first of all map the cultural differences. Where are you on the triangle, or where are you actually coming from? So people actually understand each other. The bridge part is, okay, we're going to put that, we all have empathy, we all understand now where we're coming from, so we can collaborate better, we can communicate better with each other because we know where we're coming from. But ideally, where we want to go to eventually is the integrate, where we're actually going to leverage all those strengths of that diversity. So as I said, having good ideas, having that focus and collaboration, what all those diverse elements can bring. And that's where we really are going to show our power. So our observations of multi-cultural teams. So multitude of perspectives as expected, ideas, approaches, etc. We have stimulating interactions we have seen. So in Japan, interestingly, we talk a lot about Japan. We were there for a month, so we've had a lot of visits there. We did have a team which was very, very diverse for different nationalities. We did also gender, profession, etc. So we've seen a lot there. I'll go back into the next slide. It does require time, as I said. You want to have that match, bridge, integrate process where you want to go on to. And one important thing is indeed to define clear goals so that you minimize misinterpretation, because there are so many different things how people can actually, assume. You may have people making assumptions for other people, so hence why. So this is a team I was talking about. Not everyone is in there. There was, I think, 2 other girls as well still working there. So this was a team of someone from the United States, Canada, Italy, Spain, Japan, and Philippines, I think. I don't think I missed anyone out. The Scrum Master was from the Philippines. We had some discussions with her as well. She said it was quite hard to facilitate. They were doing Scrum, facilitate the Scrum events. She did some, in the beginning, had people storming out. There was quite some storming going on there. However, nowadays, they really, really integrated all that diversity in their team. They're a very successful startup, which is really innovative in Japan as well. So they managed to do it. So the takeaways, I'm going to give you to David again, and then we'll hopefully finish on time.
Thank you. So we've tried to cover a heck of a lot there in a short space of time. Agile around the world and culture, it's a big subject. So what are our main takeaways? Well, we believe that different cultural behaviors is going to impact Agile. It can be a strength or it can be an impediment. But the first step is actually understanding it. So having awareness of cultural differences within our teams and within our organizations is key for us to start managing it and thinking of strategies on how we overcome it. So we believe some cross-cultural training, workshops, building understanding and empathy for each other as we get more diversity in our teams and organizations is a key to get into that highly performing state that Glaudia was talking about. Want to mention as well, we had an amazing journey last year. We saw so many cool things from companies that were adopting practices such as holacracy or Management 3.0. We saw movements such as Happy Melly. There's so much great stuff going on in the Agile community around the world, and we believe that there's so much that the global community can actually learn from each other. So we really want to encourage having a look at what is going on in different communities in the world. But our main message is actually accepting and embracing the fact that adopting Agile is a culture shift in itself. And we all know that change is hard, adopting Agile is a challenge. But we believe with perseverance, with time, with patience, and with the right support and with the right strategies to think about these impediments or challenges and setting up the right environment, we do believe that Agile can work in any environment. And we've seen it in all of the different countries that we've been to. So back to the question at the beginning, can Scrum work in China? Does Agile work in Germany? We believe from what we've seen, yes, Agile can work in any culture. Thank you very much for listening. Like I say, we've tried to cover a heck of a lot in a 45-minute talk. We've been blogging about our journey, the different people that we've met, the different organizations. So if you want to read more, here's our company website, redtangerine.org/blog. Amongst some other stuff, you can read more about our journey. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very, very much.